Captain Hansel Kim gripped the metal railing of his command bridge as warning lights flashed red across every screen. The battleship Defiance had been humanity's pride for 15 years. But today it felt small and fragile against the vast darkness of space. Through the main viewing window, he could see the familiar formations of Allied ships, crystalline vessels that sparkled like diamonds. Organic ships that pulsed with living light, and energy beings that looked like moving stars. For 200 years, these aliens had been humanity's friends. Together, it fought the Vorthok swarm, a terrible enemy that ate entire worlds and turned everything into more of themselves. The war had been hard, but with 12 different alien species working together, they had been winning. Hansel had grown up hearing stories of the Great Alliance. His grandfather had fought in the first battles alongside the Zenthari warriors. His father had served on mixed crews where humans and aliens worked side by side. The Alliance was more than just military cooperation. It was proof that different species could become family. But something was wrong today. Very wrong, Captain, called Park Min-woo from the communications station, his young voice cracking with stress. I'm losing contact with Admiral Zelthic's flagship. Their entire battle group just stopped talking to us. Hansel felt ice form in his stomach. Admiral Zelthic was one of the most reliable Zenthari commanders. His ships never went silent, not even during the worst battles. Run a diagnostic on our communication systems, Hansel ordered, though he already knew what Min-woo would find. Systems are perfect, sir. But the Zenthari aren't responding. It's like they just ... turned off. Through the viewport, Hansel watched the Zenthari ships maintain their perfect formations. But they no longer moved with purpose. They drifted like ghosts, beautiful but empty. Then it spread like a plague across the entire Allied fleet. The biomechanical ships of the Thrakari, which usually pulsed with organic rhythms, became still as death. The energy beings of the Luxon, who normally danced through space like living aurora, dimmed to barely visible sparks. Even the massive fortress ships of the Corvin, built like flying mountains, simply stopped moving. Lieutenant Commander Yoon, Sora, the ship's tactical officer, was frantically checking her sensors. Captain, long-range scanners show Allied ships are turning around. They're heading back to their home systems. All of them. That's impossible, Hansel whispered. But even as he said it, he watched the truth unfold before his eyes. Ship after ship, fleet after fleet, every Allied vessel was abandoning the battlefield, not retreating from enemy fire, not falling back to regroup, simply leaving. As if humanity had never existed. The communication system crackled to life with Admiral Lee Dongmin's voice from Earth Command. The old Admiral's words carried the weight of 2 centuries of partnership crashing down. All human vessels, immediate withdrawal to Sol System. The Alliance is over. We're on our own. Sora's face went white as paper as she pulled up the tactical. Display numbers flowed across her screen. Enemy ship counts, force distributions, battle projections. Her hands shook as she read them. Captain, without our allies, the Vorthok outnumber us almost 1,000 to 1. These aren't fighting odds. This is extinction. Hansel stared at the massive enemy armada approaching through the darkness. Vorthok's swarm moved like a single creature, billions of insect-like ships flowing through space with perfect coordination. Each vessel was grown rather than built, created from the consumed remains of dead worlds. They had no individual thoughts, no personal desires, only the endless hunger of the collective mind that controlled them all. For 200 years, humanity had never faced them alone. There had always been the crystalline shields of the Veltar, the biological weapons of the Thrakari, the pure energy blasts of the Luxen. Now there was only silence where songs of friendship had once played. Signal all human ships, Hansel said, his voice steady, despite the fear growing in his chest. We're going home. As the human fleet began its long journey back to Earth, Hansel watched their former allies disappear into the distance. Ships that had fought beside them for generations were now heading away, carrying with them 2 centuries of shared victories, shared losses, and shared dreams of a better galaxy. The Vorthok swarm sensed the change immediately. Their collective minds spread across billions of individual vessels, recognized that their greatest enemy now stood alone. The ships began to move faster, their formations tightening like a predator preparing to strike. Hansel closed his eyes. For a moment, feeling the weight of his species' future pressing down on him. When he opened them again, Earth was just a tiny blue dot in the distance. But it was home. And somehow, against impossible odds, humanity would have to find a way. To defend it, the great silence had fallen, and the final chapter of the human story was about to begin. Deep beneath the surface of Earth, in a bunker carved from solid rock, Admiral Lee Dongmin sat at the head of a metal table surrounded by humanity's greatest military minds. The old admiral's weathered face showed every one of his 70 years. As he stared at the holographic display floating above them, red dots spread across the galaxy like drops of blood and water, each one representing a Vorthok fleet consuming everything in its path. The bunker had been built during the early days of the Alliance, when humanity was still learning that they were not alone in the universe. Now it served as the last command center for a species that might soon be extinct. General Park Ji-won, a tall woman with gray streaks in her black hair, stood and pointed to a series of blue dots on the display. "Sir, our evacuation ships are ready. We can move 2 billion people to the outer colonies within 6 months. The mining stations on Europa and Titan can support limited populations, and the agricultural domes on Mars can stop uninterrupted." Dr. Kim Yujin, her voice sharp with frustration. The xenobiologist was younger than most people in the room, but her expertise with alien life forms had made her invaluable during the war. "Where exactly do you think we can run to? I've spent the last week studying Vorthok communication patterns, and their message is very clear. They don't want to rule us or enslave us. They want to absorb us completely." She activated her tablet, and the holographic display changed to show brain scans of various alien species. "Look at these patterns. Neural absorption, followed by biological consumption. They take our minds first, add our thoughts and memories to their collective consciousness, and then they eat our bodies to make more ships. There is no escape from something like that." The room became deadly quiet. Several generals shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Admiral Lee had seen many battles, but the fear in his officers' eyes was something new. Captain Cho Haeonki cleared his throat. He was a young man, barely 30, but he had just returned from the most dangerous mission any human had attempted. A reconnaissance flight into abandoned Allied territory. "Dr. Kim is right. I have proof." He stood and walked to the display controls. 3 days ago, I intercepted a damaged Xanthari cruiser that was jumping back to their home system. The ship was barely functioning, so I managed to board it before it escaped. The display changed again, now showing a video recording from Cho's helmet camera. The footage was dark and grainy, taken inside the alien vessel. As the camera moved through the corridors, it revealed Xanthari warriors, the proud, independent fighters that humanity had called friends for 2 centuries. But these were not the same beings. They moved in perfect unison, their normally bright eyes now glowing with a cold, alien light. When one turned its head, all the others turned at exactly the same angle. When one raised its weapon, they all raised theirs in identical motions. "They're still alive," Cho said quietly, "but they're not themselves anymore. They respond as one mind, like parts of a machine." Dr. Kim nodded grimly. "Neural parasites. Microscopic organisms that attach to the brainstem and override individual consciousness. The Vorthok release them into the air or water supply of conquered worlds. First, the leaders get infected, generals, politicians, scientists. Then they convince their own people to accept the parasites willingly." She pulled up another display showing brain scans. Every species that has ever joined the Vorthok swarm went through the same process. The parasites don't destroy the original personality, they store it as data while using the body as a puppet. Billions of minds trapped inside their own heads, watching as their bodies serve the swarm. Admiral Lee felt sick to his stomach. The thought of his friends, his allies, imprisoned inside their own minds, while their bodies betrayed everything they had once believed in, was almost too horrible to imagine. "How long do we have?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. Dr. Kim manipulated the display to show the Vorthok advance routes, based on their current speed and the time needed to fully absorb each conquered system, approximately 6 months until they reach our outer colonies, 12 months until they arrive at Earth. The room erupted in worried whispers. Some generals began discussing evacuation plans again. Others talked about surrendering before the invasion began, hoping that cooperation might earn humanity a quicker death. A few suggested hiding in deep space, hoping the Vorthok might overlook small groups of survivors. But Admiral Lee stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the metal floor. The whispers stopped as every person in the room turned to look at him. His weathered face was set with the kind of determination that had carried humanity through 2 centuries of war. 12 months, he said, his voice carrying clearly through. The bunker. 12 months to do something that no other species in galactic history has ever accomplished. We're going to stand alone against the swarm, and we're going to win. Several officers started to protest, but Lee raised his hand for silence. We're not running to the colonies to die slowly. We're not surrendering to become puppets. And we're certainly not hiding in space hoping they'll forget about us. His voice grew stronger with each word. Alert all colonies, all stations, all ships. Total war mobilization begins immediately. Every human being, every resource, every idea, everything we have goes toward one goal. As the council members filed out to begin preparations for humanity's final war, Dr. Kim remained at the table, staring at the brain scans of infected Xanthari. Somewhere in those twisted neural pathways lay the secret to understanding their enemy. And perhaps, if she was very lucky and very smart, the key to defeating them. Earth changed overnight in ways that would have seemed impossible just months before. Every peaceful city became a military base. Every school became a training center. Every park and garden was torn up to make room for weapons factories. Blue and green world that had been humanity's peaceful home for so long now buzzed with the constant sound of construction and preparation. In the orbital shipyards that floated around the moon, workers never stopped moving. They worked in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, building warships faster than anyone had ever built them before. The ships were not beautiful like the crystalline vessels of their former allies. But they were strong and built for one purpose, fighting the Vorthok. Commander Jang Minho walked through the underground research facility beneath Seoul. At Korea, the hallways were packed with scientists, engineers, and military officers, all working on humanity's most important project. This wasn't about building bigger guns or stronger armor. This was about finding a completely new way to fight. Dr. Edge Song Ji-hai, a brilliant woman in her 40s, led him to a room filled with computer screens and holographic displays. She had been studying warfare for 20 years, but the past few months had changed everything she thought she knew about fighting. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a large screen that showed different colored dots moving in patterns. "These are computer simulations of how different species fight in space battles." The screen showed the Xanthari fighting patterns first. Their ships moved in perfect geometric shapes, triangles, squares, and circles that rotated with mathematical precision. Every movement was calculated and efficient. "Now watch the thruckery," Dr. Song continued. The display changed to show organic-looking formations that moved like schools of fish, flowing together in smooth, predictable waves. And here are the Luxon energy beings. This time the patterns looked like flowing rivers of light, beautiful. But following clear rules and logic, every alien species we've ever met fights the same way, Dr. Song explained. They use logic, mathematics, and perfect coordination. Their every move can be predicted by a smart enemy.
How?
Minho studied the patterns carefully. And the Vorthok. The Vorthok are the ultimate version of this thinking. One mind controlling billions of ships, making every decision with perfect logic and no wasted movement. They've been winning for thousands of years because they outthink every enemy they face. Dr. Song smiled and changed the display one more time. Now it showed human fighting patterns, and Minho blinked in surprise. The formations looked like chaos, ships spreading out in random directions. changing course without warning, making decisions that seemed to have no pattern at all. "This looks like a disaster," Minho said. "Exactly." Dr. Song replied, her eyes bright with excitement. "Every alien species looks at human military tactics and thinks we're crazy. We make decisions that no logical species would make. We change our plans in the middle of battle for no good reason. We take risks that should get us killed." She pulled up historical battle records from the war against the Vorthok, but somehow it works. Human commanders have won battles that should have been impossible. We've saved situations that any computer would have called hopeless. Why? 'Cause we don't think like machines. Minho was beginning to understand. The Vorthok expect logical behavior. If we act ILLOG, ICALLY ... they can't predict us, Dr. Song finished. "We're calling it Project Chaos. Instead of trying to be more organized than the Vorthok, we're going to be more random than they can handle." While they talked in the underground lab, Captain Hansol Kim was putting their theory to the test in space. His small fleet of 5 destroyers had found a Vorthok scouting group near the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. The enemy had 12 ships, more than twice the human force. Traditional military thinking would have called for a coordinated attack. The human ships should form up in a battle line, concentrate their fire on the weakest enemy ship, and work together to pick off the Vorthok vessels one by one. Was logical, efficient, and exactly what the enemy expected. Instead, Hansol gave an order that would have horrified every military academy in the galaxy. All ships, break formation immediately. No coordination, no predetermined attack patterns. Each captain choose your own target and approach. Trust your instincts, not your training. The human ships scattered like frightened birds, each one heading in a different direction. Captain Park on the destroyer Lightning decided to hide behind a large asteroid and wait for a surprise attack. Captain Lee on the Thunder charged straight at the enemy formation, firing wildly. Captain Choi on the Storm began flying in circles, confusing the Vorthok targeting systems. The Vorthok collective mind, which had been controlling trillions of battles across the galaxy, suddenly found itself facing something it had never encountered before: complete unpredictability. Their ships tried to form defensive patterns, but every time they adapted to counter one human ship, another would do something completely different. Captain Park emerged from behind his asteroid at exactly the moment the Vorthok weren't expecting it. Captain Lee's wild charge distracted 3 enemy ships, allowing Captain Choi to attack them from behind. The human ships fought like 5 separate wars happening at the same time. The Vorthok couldn't keep up. In 30 minutes it was over. All 12 Vorthok ships were destroyed. Humanity hadn't lost a single vessel. Back on Earth, Colonel Bae Soo-young watched the battle recordings with amazement. "Look at this," she said to her staff. "The Vorthok kept trying to predict what our ships would do next, but they couldn't because our own captains didn't know what they were going to do until they did it." It was a small victory against a huge enemy, but it proved something important. For the first time since their allies had abandoned them, humanity had hope. Hope born from the crazy idea that sometimes the best strategy is to have no strategy at all. The darkness of space around Saturn's moon Titan was filled with more ships than any human had ever seen in one place. The Vorthok main fleet stretched across millions of kilometers, a living wall of chitinous vessels that moved together like a single enormous creature. Their billions of ships created an eclipse that blocked out the distant sun, casting Titan's station into an artificial night. Admiral Park Soo-jin stood on the bridge of her command ship, watching the enemy approach through the main viewing screen. She was a small woman in her 50s, with graying hair and scars on her hands from years of military service. Behind her, the last major human outpost before Earth itself buzzed with desperate activity. "Enemy count is still climbing," reported her tactical officer, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air of the bridge. "Current estimate is 40 billion vessels and rising. They outnumber us 50,000 to 1. Admiral Park nodded calmly, though her stomach felt like ice. Humanity had spent 8 months preparing for this moment, working day and night to create weapons that their enemies had never seen before. Now, It was time to find out if their desperate innovations would be enough. Deploy the ghost ships. She ordered from hidden positions behind asteroids and inside empty cargo containers. Hundreds of small vessels suddenly appeared. These ships looked exactly like human destroyers and cruisers, but they carried no human crews. Instead, their computer brains had been programmed with the thinking patterns of humanity's best commanders, all the randomness, creativity, and unpredictability that made human tactics so effective to the Vorthok sensors. Each ghost ship appeared to contain a living crew making independent decisions. The swarm's collective mind, which had been focused like a laser beam on the human fleet, suddenly found itself trying to track and predict the movements of hundreds of additional targets, each one behaving in completely different ways. Dr. Kim. Yujin watched the ghost ships launch from her position in the command ship's medical bay. The xenobiologist had spent the last 8 months working on humanity's most dangerous weapon, something she called the neural firewall. The technology was completely untested, and early simulations suggested that anyone who used it had only a 30% chance of survival. She activated the ship's communication system, her voice carrying to every human vessel in the fleet. Attention all personnel. I need volunteers for the Neural Firewall project. This requires direct connection between a human brain and our computer systems. Medical estimates suggest a 70% chance of brain death for anyone who participates. She expected maybe a dozen volunteers, perhaps 20 if she was lucky. Instead, within 5 minutes, over 200 crew members had reported 2 medical stations across the fleet. Men and women of all ages, from 18-year-old recruits to 60-year-old veterans, all willing to risk their lives for a weapon that might not even work. Lieutenant Nam Hosiuk was the first to connect to the firewall system. He was a young communications officer, barely 25 years old, with a wife and infant daughter back on Earth, as the medical technicians attached the neural interface cables to his head. His hands shook slightly, but his voice was steady. Ready when you are, Doctor. Dr. Kim activated the system, and Lieutenant Nam screamed. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It felt like his skull was being torn apart from the inside as alien neural patterns crashed against his mind like ocean waves against a cliff. The Vorthok collective consciousness was trying to absorb him, to add his thoughts and memories to their vast mental network, but instead of being overwhelmed, something incredible happened. The firewall technology didn't just protect Nam's mind, it turned his brain into a weapon. Every alien thought pattern that tried to enter his consciousness was reflected back, amplified and twisted into chaotic noise. The effects spread through the quantum-entangled network that connected every Vorthok ship. For the first time in thousands of years, the swarm's perfect unity began to crack. Individual ships started receiving contradictory orders. Some vessels stopped moving entirely as their crews struggled with the alien concept of thinking for themselves.
It's working.
Dr. Kim shouted, watching her monitoring equipment as the neural disruption spread through the enemy fleet like a virus. The firewall is cascading through their entire network. Across the battlefield, the Vorthok fleet began to fall apart. Ships that had moved in perfect formation for millennia suddenly found themselves cut off from the collective mind. Some crews, experiencing individual thought for the first time, simply shut down in confusion. Others, driven mad by the sudden isolation, began attacking their own formations. Admiral Park watched in amazement as billions of enemy ships descended into chaos. All human vessels. This is our chance. Press the attack while they're vulnerable. The human fleet, outnumbered beyond all reason just minutes before, suddenly found itself fighting an enemy that couldn't coordinate its own movements. Ghost ships darted between confused Vorthok formations, their unpredictable tactics causing even more disruption. Real human vessels followed up with precise strikes against enemy ships that were no longer protected by the collective strategic thinking. What had begun as humanity's last desperate stand became something unprecedented. The first time in galactic history that the Vorthok swarm had been forced to retreat. But this wasn't the organized withdrawal of a superior force. This was panic, pure and simple, as billions of creatures who had never learned to think independently fled from an enemy they could no longer understand. Lieutenant Nam Hosiok, survived the neural interface, though he would never be quite the same as medical teams rushed to help him and the other Firewall volunteers. Admiral Park realized that humanity had just accomplished the impossible. They had taught the galaxy's most feared enemy the meaning of fear. 6 months had passed since the great battle at Titan Station, and the galaxy was a completely different place. Admiral Hansal Kim stood at the large window of his new ship, the Unconquered, looking out at the blue and white marble that was Earth. The planet looked peaceful from this distance, but he could see the scars left by humanity's desperate preparation for war. New orbital platforms, defensive stations, and the skeletal remains of shipyards that had worked without rest for nearly a year. The Unconquered was humanity's newest and largest warship, built from lessons learned during their impossible victory. It was not as beautiful as the crystalline ships of the old Alliance, but it was strong and practical. Designed by people who had learned that sometimes ugly things could accomplish what pretty things could not. Admiral called Captain Yoon, Sora, from behind him. She had been promoted to first officer after her excellent service during the war, and Hansal trusted her completely. "We're getting a transmission from the Zenthari delegation. They're requesting permission to come aboard." Hansal nodded and walked to the main bridge. The large viewing screen flickered to life, showing a face he remembered well. Ambassador Veltok of the Zenthari. But something was different about the alien's appearance. The strange, glowing light that had filled his eyes during humanity's abandonment was gone, replaced by the clear, intelligent gaze that Hansal remembered from the early days of their alliance. "Admiral Kim," the Zenthari said, his voice carried through the universal translator with a tone of deep sadness and shame. We remember everything now. The neural parasites that the Vorthok infected us with, they made us abandon you when you needed us most. We did not come to ask for your forgiveness, because we know we do not deserve it. We came to try to understand how you did the impossible." Hansal studied the alien ambassador carefully. Over the past months, representatives from dozens of species had come to Earth with similar messages. The Veltar, the Thrakri, the Luxon, and many others, all former allies who had been controlled by Vorthok neural parasites. Now freed by the chaos that humanity had unleashed on the collective mind. "You want to know how we survived?" Hansal asked simply. "We refused to give up. When everyone else became silent, we became louder. When everyone else stopped fighting, we fought harder." Dr. Kim Eugene entered the bridge, walking carefully with the aid of a cane. The neural firewall experiments had saved humanity, but left her with permanent nerve damage that made walking difficult. Despite her injuries, she was still the galaxy's leading expert on the Vorthok collective consciousness. "Your people made logical decisions," she said to Ambassador Veltok. "The Vorthok were too strong, their technology too advanced, their numbers too great. Any reasonable species would have retreated or accepted absorption into their collective, but humans are not always reasonable. Sometimes we do impossible things simply because someone told us we could not do them." The Zenthari ambassador nodded slowly, his alien features showing what humans had learned to recognize as deep thought. "This is why we have come. We wish to propose a new kind of alliance. Not one based on shared technology or mutual military benefit, but on the principle you have shown us that freedom and independence are worth any cost, no matter how impossible the odds might seem." Through the large windows of the bridge, Hansal could see Earth rotating slowly in the distance. The planet still bore the marks of humanity's desperate year of preparation: industrial scars, new military installations, and the cleared areas where entire cities had been converted to weapons factories. But it was still home, still the blue and green world where humans had learned to dream of the stars. Humanity had faced complete extinction while standing completely alone, and they had not just survived, they had won. More than that, they had become something new, something that the galaxy had never seen before. They were the species that had taught the universe's most feared enemy what it meant to be afraid. "We will consider your proposal," Hansal said finally, "but you must understand something first. Any alliance with humanity means accepting that we will never stop fighting for what we believe in. We will never surrender, no matter how hopeless the situation appears." We will never be logical when logic tells us to give up hope. As the transmission ended, and the Xanthari delegation prepared to board the ship for formal negotiations, Colonel Bae Soo-young approached with a datapad full of reports. She was smiling, which was unusual for the normally serious military officer. "Sir, you need to see this," she said, handing him the pad. "We have received formal requests from 47 different species asking to join our military training programs. They want to learn what they are calling the Chaos Doctrine, how to fight unpredictably. It's how to make decisions that no computer can anticipate, how to win battles that should be impossible to win." Hansal looked at the list of species names. Many of them former enemies who had once considered humanity to be primitive and chaotic. Now they wanted to learn from the very traits they had once mocked. He smiled as he realized that Earth had taught the galaxy the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest strength comes not from who stands beside you in battle, from who you become when everyone else walks away and leaves you to fight alone. The stars would never look at humanity the same way again.